Inspector Purbright arrived in First Light Parish at 6 minutes, a time selected less for urgency than courtesy. The bells were not ringing, but they had clearly been considered. Their silence possessed the careful quality of something postponed rather than forgotten. A mist lay across the churchyard with sufficient restraint to be picturesque, though Purbright suspected it had no such intention. He paused at the gate, read the modest brass notice reminding visitors that dogs were discouraged, and proceeded in a manner that implied agreement. The church itself stood with the particular confidence of a building long accustomed to being forgiven. Its stonework showed repairs made at different times by different hands, each attempting humility while leaving a signature. Purbright noted this without judgment. He had always found churches to be less interested in God than in continuity, which was quite enough to occupy them. A constable waited near the porch, hat in hand, his expression trained into neutrality. He greeted the inspector with relief carefully disguised as respect. Inside, the air was cool and faintly medicinal. The body had already been removed, a fact which several people would later mention as though it were an inconvenience rather than a necessity. Purbright did not object. He preferred his deaths filtered through conversation, where the essential damage was more visible. He stood at the altar steps, looking down at stone that had been cleaned with unusual enthusiasm. The effort had not erased the impression of disturbance, only confirmed it. Something, he thought, had happened here that no amount of polish could restore to its original arrangement. The vicar approached him after a minute, having first adjusted a prayer book that did not require adjustment. He was a tall man, thin, with a voice that suggested reasonableness as a personal achievement. "Inspector Purbright," he said, inclining his head, "I'm terribly sorry it should be under such circumstances." Purbright inclined his own head fractionally less. "Circumstances rarely consult us, Mr. Halloway. One does what one can—" "Yes, quite." The vicar clasped his hands, then separated them, apparently dissatisfied with the effect. "We have done our utmost to cooperate. Naturally, I should expect nothing less," Purbright replied. He allowed his gaze to travel, not rudely, but with the mild curiosity of someone interested in architecture. "You discovered the deceased yourself?" The vicar hesitated for the length of a polite breath. "I was alerted by the sacristan. He arrives early, as a rule." "As a rule," Purbright repeated. He nodded once, storing the phrase without comment. The vicar smiled, uncertain whether this was agreement. A small group had gathered near the front pews, arranged in a loose semicircle that suggested both solidarity and individual exits. Purbright recognized the configuration immediately. It was the shape taken by people who wished to be seen cooperating without appearing implicated. He moved toward them, not with authority but with inclusion, as though he were about to ask for directions rather than explanations. The parish secretary spoke first, having clearly decided that silence might be misinterpreted. She produced a notebook already open. "If it would help, Inspector, I've prepared a brief timeline, just for clarity." "That is most thoughtful," Purbright said. He did not take the notebook. "Perhaps you might keep it open. We may refer to it together." Her expression suggested mild disappointment, followed by relief. She held the notebook as one might hold a shield that had been politely declined. Others offered observations. The choir mistress corrected a time already agreed upon, then apologized for doing so. The treasurer mentioned the weather, which had been unremarkable, and apologized again. Someone else remarked that the deceased had been very committed to the parish, a phrase delivered with care, as though commitment were a condition that might fluctuate posthumously. Purbright listened. He asked no questions at first. When he did speak, it was to clarify something that had not been said. "You all seem to have been awake rather early," he observed mildly. There was a momentary exchange of glances, swift and controlled. "Preparation," the choir mistress said. "We were revising the Easter program." "Ah," Purbright replied, naturally. "Easter waits for no one." A ripple of restrained amusement passed through the group. The vicar smiled with gratitude, as though the inspector had offered comfort rather than irony. Purbright accepted this interpretation without correction. As the conversation continued, he noticed a pattern forming, not in what was said, but in how quickly certain subjects were abandoned. References to letters were made, then redirected. Mention of a disagreement dissolved into assurances of harmony. No one contradicted anyone else directly. Instead, they adjusted emphasis, like editors correcting tone rather than substance. Eventually, the parish secretary closed her notebook, perhaps unconsciously. The group began to disperse, satisfied that the appropriate amount of concern had been displayed. Purbright thanked them all with professional warmth and watched them go, noting who lingered and who did not. He returned to the altar steps alone. The stone was dry now, faintly luminous, somewhere. Above him, a clock ticked, too loudly for the hour. Purbright looked once more at the place where the body had lain, then at the place where it had not. He wondered, without urgency, who had been most relieved by its removal. The parish meeting was convened at 10 o'clock precisely, a time chosen not for convenience but for symbolism. It suggested order, daylight, and the reasonable expectation that matters could be concluded without disturbance. Inspector Purbright arrived 3 minutes early and waited in the nave, examining a notice board crowded with appeals, minutes, and gentle urgencies. The language was uniformly polite, even when requesting money. One could almost admire the discipline required to make desperation sound like suggestion. When the vestry door opened, the parish council filed in with a choreography perfected over years of modest disagreement. Chairs were adjusted, papers aligned, and expressions composed into attentive neutrality. Purbright was offered the place nearest the door, an arrangement that allowed him both easy exit and implied distance. He accepted it with thanks, as though it had been chosen for his comfort rather than their reassurance. The chairman cleared his throat. He was a retired headmaster, a man who believed deeply in procedure and faintly in truth. "Inspector Purbright," he began, "we appreciate you attending. Under the circumstances." "Circumstances have a habit of assembling committees," Purbright replied. "I am grateful for your time." This was received as civility rather than observation, which was how Purbright preferred it. The meeting proceeded with an efficiency that bordered on haste. Accounts were approved without discussion. A proposal regarding the summer fete was deferred with regret. No one mentioned the death directly until the secretary, consulting her agenda, reached an item described only as mourning incident. The phrase hung briefly in the air, insufficiently anchored. The chairman adjusted his spectacles. "Yes, well, perhaps the inspector would care to ask what he needs." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you. I am chiefly interested in routine. Routines are most revealing when interrupted." Several members nodded, pleased by the abstract nature of the remark. "We are a parish of habits," the treasurer said. "One prides oneself on reliability." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And on this particular morning, reliability failed?" A pause followed, not from confusion but from collective decision-making. The vicar spoke. "I would not say failed, altered perhaps, adjusted to necessity." "Necessity," Purbright repeated gently. He folded his hands, a gesture that suggested patience rather than insistence. "May I ask whose necessity?" The question was met with careful smiles. The secretary glanced at her notes, then chose not to read them. "There had been correspondence," she said. "Some concerns raised—" "Concerns," Purbright said. "And these concerned the deceased?" No one answered immediately. It was not refusal so much as consultation without speech. Eventually the chairman nodded. "There had been differences of opinion." "About conduct?" Purbright asked. "About suitability," the treasurer said quickly. "For certain responsibilities that required early attendance?" Purbright asked. The choir mistress shifted in her chair. "We all attend early, Inspector. It is hardly unusual." "Of course," Purbright said. "I merely wondered whether anyone had been asked not to—" This time, the silence was longer, weighted. The vicar cleared his throat. "There had been discussion," he said. "Informal. Nothing decided." "Decisions are often preceded by discussion," Purbright observed, "and sometimes followed by regret." The remark was received with polite uncertainty. The chairman smiled thinly. "We are a harmonious parish, so I have been told," Purbright said. "Harmony, however, requires tuning." A faint tension entered the room, not hostility, but the discomfort of being described too accurately. The secretary spoke again, her tone precise. "Inspector, I should emphasize that any letters exchanged were intended to preserve harmony, not disrupt it." "I am sure," Purbright said. "May I see them?" Another glance passed around the table. The treasurer shuffled his papers, as though hoping the letters might appear among them. "They were personal," he said, "not official parish correspondence. Personal letters are often the most instructive," Purbright replied. "They show what one is willing to commit to paper." The vicar hesitated, then nodded. "We can provide copies." "Thank you," Purbright said. "At your convenience." The meeting resumed its procedural rhythm, but something had shifted. Questions were answered more cautiously. Agreement came too quickly. When the chairman declared the meeting adjourned, there was a collective exhalation, as though a test had been passed, though no one was quite sure of the grade. As they stood, the choir mistress lingered, gathering her papers with unnecessary care. She addressed Purbright with a smile that was almost conspiratorial. "One hates to think," she said, "that kindness might be misunderstood." Purbright considered her for a moment. "Kindness," he said, "is frequently misunderstood, particularly by those who receive it in writing." Her smile faltered, then recovered. "Yes, well, one does one's best." "Of course," Purbright said. He left the vestry last, pausing again at the notice board. A new sheet had been pinned there, neatly typed, announcing a temporary adjustment to morning duties. The date had been amended by hand, the ink still fresh. Purbright read it twice, then once more, noting, not what it said, but what it did not. Inspector Purbright arranged the interview with the choir mistress for the afternoon, a time selected less for availability than for fatigue. Mornings invited rehearsed brightness, evenings encouraged grievance. Afternoon, by contrast, produced a tolerable honesty born of routine depletion. Miss Calder received him in the choir room with the measured warmth of a woman accustomed to correction. She gestured to a chair as though granting access rather than offering comfort. The room smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Hymnals were stacked with care, their spines aligned to suggest unanimity. A notice about attendance hung slightly crooked, its emphasis underlined twice. Miss Calder sat opposite Purbright, folding her hands atop a folder that bore no label. She smiled with restraint, the smile of someone who knew precisely how she was perceived and wished to preserve it. "I understand you wish to speak with me, Inspector," she said. "I trust the counsel was helpful." "Immensely," Purbright replied. "Committees have a way of clarifying collective intention, if not individual motive." She inclined her head, accepting this as compliment. "We do try to be united." "Unity," Purbright said, "is most impressive when maintained under pressure." A faint tightening crossed her expression. "We have always managed." Purbright opened his notebook, though he did not immediately write. "You were present early on the morning in question?" "Yes. We had rehearsal scheduled. Easter approaches." "So it does," Purbright said. "And the deceased, was he expected?" Miss Calder hesitated, then smiled again. "He was irregular, enthusiastic but not always punctual." "Enthusiasm," Purbright observed, "can be inconvenient." She allowed herself a small laugh. "That is one way of putting it." Purbright glanced at the folder before her. "You appear well PR." "Impaired." "One must be," she said. "Music suffers from improvisation." "Life does as well," Purbright replied. "May I ask what is in the folder?" Miss Calder's fingers tightened fractionally. "Programs, notes, correspondence?" "Correspondence," Purbright repeated. He waited. She opened the folder with deliberate calm and produced several letters, neatly arranged. These were exchanged over the past month. Concerns were raised, responses given. Purbright accepted the letters and read them in silence. The language was courteous to the point of strain. Phrases like "with the greatest respect" and "in the interests of harmony" appeared with alarming frequency. Each letter circled its subject without naming him directly, as though propriety might dissolve upon contact. "These are unsigned," Purbright said. "They were intended to be collective," Miss Calder replied. "We felt that anonymity would reduce offense." "Did it?" Purbright asked. She paused. "It reduced confrontation." "Not quite the same thing," Purbright said. He returned the letters. "Was the deceased aware of these concerns?" "He was informed," she said. "Gently." "Gently," Purbright echoed. "In writing?" "Yes." "And how did he respond?" "He defended himself. Politely." "At length?" Purbright considered this. "Length is often mistaken for aggression." Miss Calder stiffened. "Inspector, we are a volunteer organization. Standards must be maintained." "Of course," Purbright said. "And when standards are threatened, we address the issue collectively?" She hesitated. "As appropriate." Purbright closed his notebook. "On the morning of the incident, did you speak with him?" "Yes," she said. "Briefly, about?" "The rehearsal." "His role and the letters?" Her gaze dropped for the first time. "They were mentioned. In what terms?" She chose her words carefully. "I reminded him that decisions were pending." "Pending," Purbright said. "And how did he receive this reminder?" "He was displeased." "Did he raise his voice?" "No." "Did he make threats?" "Certainly not." Purbright nodded. "Did he seem surprised?" "Yes," she said. "That was the difficulty." "The difficulty?" Purbright prompted. He believed the matter resolved. Purbright leaned back slightly. Resolved by whom? Miss Calder did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was cooler. By himself, I imagine. Purbright stood, signaling the end of the interview. Thank you, Miss Calder. Your clarity has been most helpful. She rose as well, smoothing her skirt. I hope you understand our position, Inspector. We acted out of concern. Concern, Purbright said, is a versatile motive. As he left, he noticed a sheet of music on the stand, marked heavily in pencil. A note in the margin caught his eye, remove after final rehearsal. He did not mention it. Outside, the afternoon light had flattened the churchyard, erasing shadows without resolving outlines. Purbright paused, considering who had decided when the final rehearsal would occur and who would not be invited. The parish council reconvened 2 days later, this time without the pretense of agenda. Inspector Purbright had not requested the meeting. Nevertheless, it assembled itself with admirable promptness. There was a sense, faint but discernible, that absence might be interpreted as position-taking. Attendance, therefore, became a moral act. Chairs were again arranged, though with less confidence, and papers were brought more from habit than necessity. Purbright observed these preparations with detached approval. Communities, he had learned, preferred rituals even when substance was in question. The chairman greeted him with a firmness that suggested resolution rather than welcome. We thought it best, he said, to clarify anything that may have been left ambigu. Ambiguity has its uses, Purbright replied, but clarity can be restorative. This was taken as encouragement. The treasurer spoke first, addressing the room rather than the inspector. We have all been distressed, naturally, and if any misunderstandings arose. Misunderstandings rarely arise alone, Purbright said mildly. They are usually invited. The treasurer subsided, nodding. The vicar adjusted his cuffs, a gesture that conveyed patience under strain. Inspector, he said, we are concerned that certain discussions are being viewed out of proportion. Proportion, Purbright said, depends upon vantage. He turned his attention to the secretary. You keep the minutes? Yes, she said promptly. With accuracy. I am sure, Purbright said. May I ask about omissions? She blinked. Omissions. Items deferred, Purbright clarified. Concerns noted but not recorded. The secretary glanced at the chairman, who cleared his throat. We try to maintain focus on constructive matters. An admirable aim, Purbright said. And what is done with unconstructive ones? They are addressed privately, the choir mistress said. Out of courtesy. Courtesy, Purbright repeated. And privacy. Yes, she said. We feel public discussion can be damaging. To whom? Purbright asked. There was a pause, brief but expressive. The vicar answered. To the parish. Purbright nodded. And the deceased, was he considered part of that parish? Of course, the vicar said quickly. He was a valued member. Valued, Purbright said. In what capacity? Another silence, this one more deliberate. The treasurer spoke again. He had limitations. Limitations, Purbright said. As do we all. Yes, the treasurer agreed, relieved. Precisely. Purbright leaned forward slightly. I am interested in how those limitations were managed. The chairman adjusted his spectacles. We offered guidance. In writing? Purbright asked. Yes, the secretary said. Collectively? And orally? Purbright asked. The choir mistress hesitated. Occasionally, on the morning in question? Purbright pressed. She hesitated again, longer. There was an exchange. An exchange, Purbright said. Of views? Yes. Witnessed? No, she said. Not directly. Purbright let that rest. He shifted his gaze to the vicar. You were alerted after the fact, yes. By whom? The sacristan. Who arrived early, as a rule, Purbright said. As a rule, the vicar echoed. Rules, Purbright said, are comforting. The meeting had begun to lose its cohesion. Members spoke less readily, choosing their moments with care. The secretary's pen hovered above her notebook without touching it. Purbright sensed that the collective instinct now favored restraint over explanation. He stood. I am grateful for your candor, he said. It has been most consistent. This produced uncertain smiles. As the council members gathered their papers, Purbright lingered near the window. Outside, the churchyard was being tended by a volunteer, who trimmed hedges with meticulous attention, avoiding a particular corner where the ground dipped slightly. Purbright watched for a moment, then turned back to the room. One final matter, he said. The timing of your correspondence. The secretary looked up. Yes? Several letters were dated after decisions had ostensibly been made, Purbright said. Yet they speak of matters pending. The chairman frowned. We wish to allow time. For whom? Purbright asked. No one answered. The vicar folded his hands. For reflection. Reflection, Purbright said. And during that interval the deceased continued his duties? Yes, the choir mistress said. Until further notice. And who was to provide that notice? Purbright asked. Again, silence. It was not defensive. Now, merely uncertain. Purbright nodded, satisfied. He took his leave with formal thanks, declining tea with regret. As he stepped into the nave, he noticed a notice pinned beside the hymn board, an amendment to the roster, handwritten, initialed by no one. It reassigned early duties indefinitely. Purbright read it once, then again. He noted the absence of a name where one might reasonably expect it, and wondered who had decided that absence could be permanent without announcement. Mrs. Alderton lived in the narrow house nearest the churchyard wall, a position she described without irony as convenient for reflection. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 4, when the light had begun to soften without yet conceding to evening. The house answered his knock promptly, as though it had been expecting him and had merely delayed opening out of courtesy. Mrs. Alderton was a widow of careful habits. She wore black without severity and spoke with a precision that suggested long practice in being overheard. She ushered Purbright into a sitting room arranged around restraint rather than comfort. The mantelpiece held no photographs, only a small vase of dried flowers, replaced regularly and remarked upon by no one. I understand you wish to speak with me, Inspector, she said, seating herself opposite him. I was not certain how useful I might be. Usefulness is often retrospective, Purbright replied. One does not always recognize it at the time. She nodded, accepting this as neither reassurance nor challenge. I have followed the matter with interest. Naturally, Purbright said. You were acquainted with the deceased? Yes, she said. Through the parish. Through my husband. And your husband's involvement? Purbright asked. He sang, she said, faithfully. Not especially well, but with conviction. Conviction can be persuasive, Purbright observed. It can also be exhausting, she said calmly. Purbright allowed a faint pause. You were part of the flower rota. For many years, she said. One learns a great deal arranging flowers. Placement matters. So does a mission. Indeed, Purbright said. And on the morning in question? I was not present, she said. My duties begin later. I arrived after the disruption. Disruption, Purbright repeated. She inclined her head. It seemed the appropriate term. Purbright glanced around the room. You have a letter, he said, not as a question. Mrs. Alderton smiled faintly. Several, she said. But I assume you mean a particular one. She rose and retrieved an envelope from a drawer in a side table. It was unaddressed, unsealed. She handed it to Purbright without ceremony. I never sent it, she said. I decided it would not help. Purbright read it slowly. The tone was courteous, restrained, and unmistakably wounded. It spoke of concern, of the parish's good name, of the difficulty of confronting behavior that embarrassed without quite offending. The deceased was mentioned obliquely, referred to as a certain member whose enthusiasm had begun to attract comment. You wrote this to the vicar, Purbright said. Yes. And you chose not to send it. Yes. Why? She considered. I suspected it would be added to a collection. A collection, Purbright said. Of worries, she replied. Filed away until they acquired weight through repetition. Purbright returned the letter. Did others write? Oh yes, she said, with more confidence. And did those letters produce results? They produced meetings, she said, and discussions, and delays. Delays, Purbright said. Do you know why? Mrs. Alderton folded her hands. Because no one wished to be responsible. Responsible for what? Purbright asked. For deciding, she said. It is safer to be unanimous in postponement tea. And singular in action. Purbright nodded. And the deceased, was he aware of these deliberations? Partially, she said. He sensed disapproval. He did not understand its source. Did anyone explain it to him? Purbright asked. She smiled, without humor. Not directly. Indirectness, Purbright said, has its dangers. It also has its defenders, she replied. Purbright rose, signaling that the visit was drawing to a close. One final question, he said. On the morning of the incident, did you receive any communication from the parish? Mrs. Alderton hesitated, just perceptibly. A notice, she said, pinned to the board. About duties, and what did it say? That arrangements had been adjusted, she said. Temporarily, Purbright repeated. Yes, she said, though no end date was specified. Purbright thanked her and took his leave. As he stepped back into the street, he glanced toward the churchyard wall. From this angle he could see the altar steps through an open door, pale in the late light. He thought of the unsent letter and of how many others like it might exist, polite, restrained, and ultimately ineffective. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the parish's greatest effort had been expended not in causing harm, but in ensuring that no single hand could be identified as having done so. Inspector Purbright spent the morning with parish correspondence, a task he approached with professional patience. The documents had been arranged for him in the vestry, stacked in careful piles that suggested both transparency and control. The secretary hovered briefly, offering tea and clarification, then withdrew with visible relief. Papers, after all, could not contradict themselves aloud, which made them safer company. The letters revealed a community skilled in indirection. Dates were precise, meanings less so. Many began with apologies for WR. Iting it all, followed by several paragraphs justifying the necessity. Others adopted the tone of shared responsibility, employing we with strategic vagueness. The deceased was referred to variously as a concern, a difficulty, or a matter requiring sensitivity. His name appeared only once, and then in a postscript, as though remembered too late to retract. Purbright read slowly, noting repetitions. Certain phrases recurred with near liturgical regularity, in the interests of harmony, with the greatest respect, pending further discussion. They functioned less as content than as insulation, padding the writers from the implications of decision. He wondered how often such language had served them well in other matters. One letter, dated 3 weeks before the death, caught his attention. It proposed a temporary adjustment to duties, framed as an opportunity for reflection. The tone was almost benevolent. A response followed 2 days later, acknowledging the suggestion and expressing appreciation for its thoughtfulness. No action was recorded. Instead, another letter appeared, extending the period of consideration. Purbright noted the pattern with interest. Delay, he reflected, had been elevated to a form of consensus. At midday, the sacristan arrived to tidy the vestry, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being overlooked. He greeted Purbright politely and began dusting surfaces already clean. Purbright observed him without comment until the man paused, cloth in hand. "You're reading the letters, sir," the sacristan said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Purbright replied. "They are most informative." The sacristan nodded. "People like to be clear on paper." "Clear," Purbright said. "Is that your impression?" The sacristan smiled faintly. "Clear enough to protect themselves." Purbright regarded him for a moment. "You arrive early," he said, "as a rule." The sacristan replied, repeating the phrase with practiced neutrality. "And on the morning in question?" "I arrived earlier than usual," he said. "There had been talk of changes." "Changes," Purbright echoed. "Yes, to the roster. Who discussed these changes with you?" The sacristan hesitated, then shrugged. "It was mentioned." "Generally, by whom?" Purbright asked. The sacristan resumed dusting. "One hears things." Purbright did not press him. Instead, he returned to the letters, allowing the silence to work. After a moment, the sacristan spoke again. "The notice was already pinned when I arrived." "Which notice?" Purbright asked. "The one about early duties," the sacristan said. "Adjusted," it said. "Was it signed?" "No." "Was it dated?" "Yes," the sacristan said. That morning, Purbright looked up. "And who usually pins notices?" The sacristan smiled, almost apologetically. "Whoever feels responsibility," Purbright said. "A flexible concept." The sacristan inclined his head and continued his work. Purbright watched him for a moment longer, then gathered the letters into a single pile. He thanked the sacristan, who responded with quiet courtesy, and left the vestry. In the nave he encountered the vicar, who was adjusting the arrangement of chairs for an evening service. The vicar greeted him warmly, though his eyes betrayed a calculation that suggested recent conversations. "Making progress?" the vicar asked. "Of a sort," Purbright replied. "Your correspondence is extensive. We value communication," the vicar said. "It prevents misunderstanding." "Does it?" Purbright asked mildly. The vicar smiled. "It allows concerns to be aired and resolved," Purbright prompted. The vicar hesitated. Eventually, Purbright nodded. "On the morning of the death, Were you aware of the notice regarding adjusted duties? The vicar's hand stilled. I became our relator. Later than whom? Purbright asked. The vicar resumed his task. Later than the sacristan, apparently. And the deceased? Purbright asked. The vicar did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was measured. I cannot say with certainty. Certainty, Purbright said, is often elusive. Yes, the vicar agreed, particularly in matters of pastoral care. Purbright took his leave shortly thereafter. Outside, the afternoon had settled into a muted clarity, the sort that revealed outlines without warmth. He paused by the notice board once more. The adjusted roster was still there, its edges curling slightly. Someone had added a penciled note beneath it, small and easily overlooked, until further review. Purbright studied the handwriting. It differed from the rest, less careful, more decisive. He wondered when it had been added, and by whom, and whether the deceased had seen it before stepping into the church that morning. The question lingered, unvoiced, as Purbright turned away, considering how often responsibility announced itself only after the fact. Inspector Purbright returned to the church at first light, a decision prompted less by instinct than by courtesy to the hour itself. Morning revealed things without enthusiasm, which suited him. The building stood unchanged, yet its composure felt rehearsed, as though it had learned to anticipate inquiry. A thin band of sunlight rested along the nave floor, stopping short of the altar steps with an almost deliberate restraint. The sacristan was already present, arranging service sheets with meticulous symmetry. He greeted Purbright with a nod that suggested recognition rather than surprise. "Early again, sir," he said. "As a rule," Purbright replied, adopting the phrase with careful neutrality. The sacristan smiled faintly and continued his task. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a shared obligation. Purbright watched the man work, noting how often his eyes drifted toward the notice board, as though expecting amendment. "You keep regular hours," Purbright said eventually. "One finds it advisable," the sacristan replied. "Churches prefer predictability. So do people," Purbright said. "Until they don't." The sacristan paused, then resumed. "There has been some confusion lately." "About duties," Purbright said. "Yes," the sacristan agreed. "And authority." Purbright regarded him. "Who holds authority here?" The sacristan considered. "Formally, the council. Informally, those who speak first." "And who speaks first?" Purbright asked. The sacristan's mouth tightened. "Those accustomed to being heard." Purbright nodded. "On the morning of the death, did you speak with the deceased?" "Yes," the sacristan said. "Briefly." "About the notice?" Purbright asked. "Yes." "And his reaction?" "He asked who had decided." "And what did you tell him?" Purbright asked. "That it was a collective matter," the sacristan said. That discussion was ongoing. "Discussion," Purbright said. "At what hour?" The sacristan glanced toward the altar. "Early enough." Purbright moved toward the steps, stopping where the light ended. "Did the deceased seem distressed?" "He seemed uncertain," the sacristan said, as though he had missed something. "Had he?" Purbright asked. The sacristan did not answer. Instead, he adjusted a stack of papers already aligned. Purbright let the silence remain, then turned away, satisfied for the moment. Later that morning, Purbright conducted brief conversations with several parishioners, none of which qualified as interviews. He asked about routines, about habits, about who preferred which pew. Answers came readily, shaped by years of social rehearsal. Each person spoke with confidence about the parish as a whole, and wit. Caution about individuals. Names were avoided where possible. Pronouns did most of the work. One elderly man mentioned that the deceased had been rather visible in recent weeks. A woman from the cleaning rota observed that visibility could be misinterpreted. Another parishioner remarked that change was unsettling, especially when introduced quietly. Purbright thanked them all, collecting impressions rather than statements. In the afternoon, he encountered the choir mistress in the churchyard. She was supervising the trimming of shrubs, offering guidance that was precise but unnecessary. She greeted Purbright with professional warmth. "Inspector," she said. "Still among us?" "For the moment," Purbright replied. "I find repetition instructive." She smiled thinly. "We have nothing to hide." "Of course," Purbright said. "One rarely does." They walked together for a short distance. "You were present early that morning," Purbright said. "Yes." "And you were aware of the notice before the deceased arrived?" She hesitated. "I was aware that adjustments were being considered." "Considered," Purbright said. "And implemented?" She stopped walking. "Inspector, we act in good faith." "I do not doubt it," Purbright said. "Good faith, however, can be decisive." She frowned slightly. I fail to see your point. Purbright gestured toward the church. Someone decided to make the adjustment visible, to pin it, to date it, to leave it unsigned. Her expression tightened. It seemed appropriate. Appropriate to whom? Purbright asked. She resumed walking. To the situation. Purbright let the answer stand. They parted politely at the gate, each satisfied that nothing improper had been said. As evening approached, Purbright returned once more to the notice board. The penciled edition remained, until further review. He examined it closely, noting the pressure of the graphite, the dense of the stroke. It was not tentative. Someone had meant it to endure. He stepped back, allowing the board to settle into his vision alongside the surrounding appeals and announcements. Taken together, they formed a portrait of a community deeply invested in appearances. He wondered how often such investments matured into obligation. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small tear at the corner of the adjusted roster, as though it had been removed and replaced. The paper bore faint creases inconsistent with a single pinning. Purbright touched the edge lightly, then withdrew his hand. Outside, the light had faded, leaving the church in a posture of benign indifference. Purbright paused at the gate, considering the possibility that the notice had not been intended merely as information, but as instruction, delivered without attribution, yet impossible to ignore. He wondered who had seen it first, and who had understood it last. The questions accompanied him as he walked away, unhurried, already anticipating the answer's reluctance. The vicar requested a private conversation in the early evening, a time that suggested reflection rather than urgency. Inspector Purbright agreed without hesitation. Clergy, he had found, preferred to speak when the day's obligations had thinned, leaving conscience more room to maneuver. They met in the vicarage study, a room arranged to encourage calm through symmetry. Books lined the walls in disciplined rows, their titles respectable and largely unread. Mr. Halloway gestured Purbright to a chair positioned at a courteous distance from the desk. Tea was offered, declined, and then discussed briefly before both men settled into stillness. The vicar folded his hands, then unfolded them, apparently dissatisfied with the symbolism. I felt it might be helpful, he began, to address certain impressions. Purbright inclined his head. Impressi. Ons are often more durable than facts. Yes, the vicar said, and sometimes more damaging. Damage, Purbright replied, is not always visible at first. The vicar smiled faintly, as though acknowledging a shared burden. Our parish has endured strain, differences of opinion, regrettable misunderstandings. Misunderstandings have featured prominently, Purbright said. They were never malicious, the vicar said quickly. Whatever may be implied, I imply very little, Purbright said. I listen. Mr. Halloway relaxed slightly. Then you will understand how difficult it is to guide a community without appearing to direct it. Guidance, Purbright said, often resembles direction when viewed from behind. The vicar accepted this with a nod. We encourage participation, collective responsibility, and collective discretion, Purbright added. Yes, the vicar said. Discretion is essential. Purbright glanced at the desk. A stack of letters sat neatly aligned, edges squared. You receive a great deal of correspondence. We are fortunate, the vicar said. People care, they care enough to write, Purbright said, less enough to decide. The vicar's smile tightened. Decisions can divide, so can postponement, Purbright replied. A brief silence followed. The vicar rose and poured himself water, though his glass was already half full. Inspector, he said, turning back, you must understand that the deceased was sensitive. Sensitivity, Purbright said, is rarely accommodated directly. No, the vicar agreed. It requires tact. And how was that tact exercised? Purbright asked. In conversation, the vicar said. In suggestion, in notices, Purbright asked. The vicar paused. The notice was intended to ease transition. For whom? Purbright asked. For everyone, the vicar said. Including him? Purbright regarded him. Did you discuss it with him persona? Lee? The vicar hesitated. Not that morning, and before. Purbright prompted. There had been attempts, the vicar said. Nothing definitive. Purbright nodded. Definitive statements are uncomfortable. They can be cruel, the vicar said. Cruelty, Purbright said, is sometimes a matter of timing. The vicar looked at him sharply, then away. Inspector, are you suggesting negligence? I suggest patterns, Purbright replied. Negligence is a conclusion. The vicar returned to his chair. We never intended harm. Intent, Purbright said, is an unreliable measure. Another silence settled, heavier than before. The ticking of a small clock became audible, precise and unyielding. The vicar spoke again, more quietly. "The parish expects reassurance." "Reassurance," Purbright said, "is not my department." "No," the vicar said, "but conclusions are." Purbright stood in time. The vicar rose as well, extending his hand. "I trust you will be considerate." "I am always careful," Purbright said, taking the hand briefly. Care, however, is not concealment. As Purbright left the study, his eye was caught by a wastebasket beside the desk. Inside lay torn strips of paper, neatly folded, their edges bearing the remnants of familiar phrasing. He did not stop to examine them. The vicar followed him to the door, offering polite farewells that carried an undercurrent of appeal. Outside, the evening had cooled, the sky settling into a color neither blue nor gray. Purbright paused on the path, recalling the wastebasket and its contents. Drafts, he reflected, were often more revealing than finished statements. He wondered what had been written, reconsidered, and then destroyed, and whether the notice on the board had once existed in similar fragments before being made whole. The thought accompanied him as he walked away, leaving the vicarage dark behind him, its windows reflecti. Nothing at all. By the 9th day, the parish had begun to behave as though a conclusion were overdue. This manifested not in impatience, but in a collective tidying of tone. Conversations shortened, expressions of sympathy became brisker, more professional. Inspector Purbright observed the change with interest. Communities, he knew, grew weary of uncertainty, not because it was painful, but because it was inefficient. He spent the morning speaking to parishioners in pairs, a method chosen for its mild inconvenience. Individuals alone tended toward candor, groups of 3 toward performance. Pairs, by contrast, revealed alignment and strain in equal measure. He seated them where possible at small tables, encouraging a posture of cooperation rather than defense. 2 members of the cleaning rota agreed readily on times and duties. Both recalled the notice appearing some time early. Neither could recall who mentioned it first. When Purbright asked whether the deceased had commented, one said he had seemed puzzled, the other that he had seemed resigned. They smiled apologetically at each other, as though the discrepancy were a social failing rather than a factual one. A pair from the choir confirmed that rehearsal had been expected, though perhaps not by everyone. They spoke warmly of the deceased's enthusiasm, less warmly of its consequences. When Purbright asked who had authority to amend the roster, both answered at once, the council. When he asked who acted for the council in practice, their replies diverged gently, then converged again into vagueness. Throughout these conversations, one omission persisted. No one mentioned the moment of discovery directly. It hovered nearby, referenced obliquely as when things became clear or after the disruption. Purbright did not press the point. He had learned that silence repeated was often more reliable than testimony. In the afternoon, he asked the secretary and the treasurer to join him together. They arrived with notebooks and an air of careful compliance. Purbright asked them to recount the sequence of correspondence in the weeks preceding the death. They did so competently, passing the narrative between them like a shared responsibility. "And the decision to adjust duties," Purbright said. "When was that reached?" The treasurer consulted his notes. "It was agreed in principle." "In principle," Purbright repeated. "Yes," the secretary said. "Subject to review." "And who was to conduct that review?" Purbright asked. They exchanged a glance. "The council," the treasurer said. "And when did the council meet to confirm it?" Purbright asked. The secretary frowned slightly. "We had not yet." Purbright nodded. "Yet the notice appeared?" "Yes," the secretary said. "Presumably as a temporary measure." "Presumably," Purbright said. "By whom?" Another pause. The treasurer cleared his throat. "It may have been assumed that consensus existed." "Assumptions," Purbright said, "can be persuasive." They agreed with this, relieved to have found common ground. Later, Purbright encountered Mrs. Alderton again, this time at the edge of the churchyard. She was tending a small border with deliberate care. She greeted him politely and continued her work. "The parish seems eager for resolution," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "Eagerness often precedes clarity." She straightened. "They will wish you to say that no one is to blame." "I rarely say what is wished," Purbright said. "I say what is accurate." She smiled faintly. "Accuracy can be very unsettling." "It can." Purbright agreed. As evening approached, Purbright returned to the church once more. The nave was empty, the light thinning toward dusk. He stood near the altar steps, considering the accumulated impressions. No act of violence suggested itself. No singular malice, instead, a narrowing of options, executed with politeness. He walked to the notice board and examined it again. The adjusted roster remained unchanged. Beneath it, the penciled phrase persisted, until further review. He noticed now a faint indentation beneath the paper, as though another sheet had once been pinned there, then removed. The board bore the impression of earlier pressure. Purbright asked the sacristan about it when he appeared, quietly locking a side door. The man considered the board, then nodded. There was another notice, he said. Earlier. What did it say? Purbright asked. The sacristan shrugged. Much the same. But unsigned. And this one? Purbright asked. This one was added later, the sacristan said. More firmly. By whom? Purbright asked. The sacristan hesitated. I couldn't say. But it was after the conversation. Which conversation? Purbright asked. The sacristan looked toward the altar steps. The one that did not go well. Purbright did not pursue the point. He thanked the sacristan and walked slowly down the aisle. At the door he paused, looking back at the board, the steps, the empty pews. He considered the possibility that the parish had not intended to exclude the deceased, but to encourage his withdrawal. A suggestion made visible, a decision left unattributed. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour with mild insistence. Purbright listened, then turned away. He was satisfied now that the answer would not be found in action, but in sequence, in who spoke first, who deferred longest, and who finally made a temporary arrangement permanent by writing it down. The rima. In question, he reflected, was not who had caused the death, but who had believed, sincerely, that nothing decisive had been done at all. Inspector Purbright convened no meeting to deliver his conclusion. He disliked the ceremonial quality such occasions acquired, as though responsibility might be distributed by seating arrangement. Instead, he requested the presence of the vicar, the chairman, and the parish secretary in the vestry, a room sufficiently small to discourage performance. They arrived punctually, each carrying papers that were not required. Purbright waited until they were seated, then remained standing, a courtesy that suggested brevity rather than authority. I have reviewed your correspondence, he said. Your notices, your habits. The chairman inclined his head. We have been entirely cooperative. Entirely, Purbright agreed. And that, in itself, has been instructive. The vicar folded his hands. Inspector, if you are about to suggest culpability, I am about to suggest sequence, Purbright said. Culpability is more diffuse. He described the pattern without embellishment, the letters that deferred, the meetings that postponed, the notice that appeared without signature yet carried consequence. He spoke calmly, naming no individual as author, attributing no intention beyond propriety. The secretary listened with professional composure, though her pen remained idle. You wish the deceased to withdraw, Purbright said, gently, without confrontation. You believe that by making his position ambiguous, he might resolve the matter himself. The vicar's expression tightened. We wish to avoid distress, and succeeded only in relocating it, Purbright said. The chairman cleared his throat. Are you suggesting the parish caused his death? I suggest the parish created the circumstances in which responsibility became optional, Purbright repel. I.e., no hand pushed, several hands withdrew. Silence followed, not shocked but reflective. The secretary spoke quietly. It was never intended to be permanent. No, Purbright said. It was intended to be temporary until it was no longer questioned. The vicar looked down. What will your report say? Purbright considered. That there was no act of violence, that the death occurred following a period of reputational pressure exercised collectively and denied individually. The chairman nodded slowly. And the parish? The parish will continue, Purbright said. Parishes always do. He stood to leave. The vicar rose as well. Inspector, he said, will there be charges? Purbright paused. There will be conclusions. Charges require intention. Later that evening, Purbright walked once more through the empty nave. The notice board had been cleared, the adjusted roster removed entirely. In its place hung a fresh announcement, formally typed, restoring previous arrangements. No reference was made to the interval between. He read it, noting the confidence of its finality. At the altar steps, he stopped, listening to the building settle. The stone remained clean, unmarked by explanation. He thought of how carefully the parish had acted to avoid blame, and how effective such care could be. As he left, he wondered whether the restoration of order would be taken as absolution, and whether anyone would trouble themselves to ask what, precisely, had been restored.